Hello and welcome to another UK column interview, and we're absolutely delighted to be able to welcome back Roger Meacock, our consultant veterinary surgeon. Now, I know many of you were delighted to see Roger's first interview, and that's the link of that is going to be in the article beneath, and that was all to do with mRNA in animals. But today we're going to talk about animals in general, about animals in 2023, whether they be farm animals, your cat, your dog. Is it safe to microchip our animals? Is it safe to vaccinate our animals? So many questions we've got to put to Roger, but without further ado, Roger, welcome back to UK Column, and thank you so much for agreeing to come back. You had a resounding welcome last time, and viewers were so pleased to see you. Could you just give us a little introduction as to why you are the last chance vet, a special vet, and the vet that does no harm? Welcome back, Roger.
Hi, Debbie. Thank you very much for inviting me back. Pleased to be here. I suppose if I tell you a little bit about my journey to how I'm doing, then that will give people a bit of an understanding. I qualified in the early 1990s as a very conventional vet, had no interest in complementary alternative practices at all, and went into farm animal practice, which I absolutely loved. And but I started messing around with magnets, but not to do with animals. I was putting them on heating systems and on water to stop calcium carbonate crystals settling out. And then the company that was making them started producing some magnetherapy products, and I really wasn't very sure if they were, perfectly good or useful or anything at all. I hadn't really got an opinion about them. But they first brought out the human ones, and obviously because at that time I'm just treating animals as a vet, I sort of ignored that. But then they brought out some animal products, and I knew that the magnets worked on the car engine efficiency and fuel efficiency and stopped the crystals settling out in the water pipe. So I thought, well, I'm not just going to stop doing something without checking it out for myself. So I gave Terry, who ran our lab in the practice, and she was a breeder of golden retrievers, so I gave her one of the dog collars to put on and sort of said, try this and see what happens. And, if in a couple of weeks' time nothing happens, we'll just forget about it. And she came up to the next day and said, do you want check or cash? And to cut long story short, it had made a miraculous difference to her old boy overnight. And I then started using sort of the horse magnets and putting them on cows, down a cow's, and got some very good positive correlation with the magnets being on and the cows being better, and take the magnets off and the cows go back down again, because very often after calving, one of the common things that cows used to do would be they'd struggle to get up. So that was sort of my journey into thinking, well, I've got this information now. I don't necessarily understand what the magnets are doing or how they're doing it, but they're certainly not putting anything foreign into the body, and they seem to be making a definite effect, positive effect. So let's use it, see what we can use it for, and try and understand it, and then you can start to predict where things can be used in different ways. So that's pretty much what I started doing. And then very soon I was introduced to a microcurrent stimulation technology from Russia that uses biofeedback, which was, I still use it today. It's probably one of the most effective treatment devices in the world as far as I'm concerned. And I was trained by the Russians when they came to the UK in 1997. I was the only vet on the course. And they hadn't really used them on animals at all. So when I spoke to the doctors and the inventors who were there and said, have these ever been used on animals? And they said, no. And I said, well, is there any reason why not? And they said, can't think of one. That's right. Well, that's good enough for me. So I got one and then started trying them on various different species. One of the first things I treated was a pig that had been badly burnt, because the outdoor units, they obviously straw down, those little huts you see in the field as you're driving around. And then they move, when they change the pigs around, they move the hut and burn the old bed, and restraw, obviously, put the new bed down in the new place. So they'd done this with this sow, and she decided it was quite cold at night, and the old bed that had been burnt felt quite warm, so she lay down on it, and it basically burnt her really badly. And the farm were concerned. Obviously, they treated her with antibiotics because the wound had got a bit infected, and they had this sort of correlation between when she was on the antibiotics, she was okay and she ate and seemed to be recovering. But if they took her off the antibiotics, because obviously they didn't want to keep her on them forever, antimicrobial resistance, farmers are very aware of that. And so I then treated this sow without really knowing if it was going to work, and went back a couple of days later. And as I walked down the track, they said, "Here comes Bones," and the doctor from Star Trek. And I thought, well, this is either good or not so good. I'm not sure. And anyway, so we went to see the pig, and the skin had grown back, and the hair was already starting to grow back, and they'd stopped the antibiotics immediately the next day. And from not wanting to eat, she was back eating again, and made a full recovery. So that was sort of my first experience of using it in an animal situation. Then I treated some horses that had some tendon injuries, and again, one of them had been retired, and we treated her, and she came back into work and didn't have another day's lameness for 5 years, having been previously retired. So, I then decided that actually this was potentially a better way forward. So I then sort of left general practice and first opinion practice, and sort of concentrated on just doing what I do, which is the natural way. And I added my bioresonance in, and various other sort of modalities as time has gone by, and I've sort of kept upgrading my Russian micro stimulation device. It's called Scanner. Every time it was being upgraded. So and just sort of kept on taking on the cases that other vets find or struggle with the conventional methods, or where people want something that's perhaps not quite so invasive or a different way forward. And that's pretty much what I specialize in doing these days. And a lot of the technology, because I was trained how to use it on people, because a lot of the technology was developed for treating people, it made sense to carry on with a human practitioner hat on to carry on treating people. And often with horses, people have fallen off or had injuries, so you sort of end up treating rider and horse together at times. And I think it's actually a better result if you do, because riding is a partnership between the rider and the horse, and the riders are very very conscientious and very careful about looking after their horses, and they tend to neglect themselves a lot of the time. And actually, if they aren't balanced and fit on top of their horse, then that will feed down into the horse as well. So you've got this holistic approach which actually encompasses more than just the horse. And obviously some riders don't need treatment, or they do other things as well. But it can often happen that the injuries in the rider can actually unbalance the horse and cause a very similar injury, almost a parallel place in the horse's body underneath. So, and I think likewise, chronic injuries in horses can potentially ricochet up as well. So, it's just sort of widening your perception to think, well, how do I get the best result possible in this situation? And that's, become my philosophy really, which is, the right person doing the right treatment at the right time in the right order.
I love that, Roger. And as you were talking about horses, I know because I live down in the West Country, so many horses, many riders, but also many dog owners and many cat owners like me. So, number one, can your methods work on dogs and cats and other animals, domestic animals? And the other thing is, I can hear our audience saying, well, how do we get to see Roger? But you go around the country, don't you? You go and visit people as opposed to patients or animals coming to visit you.
Yes, Debbie. I mean, I don't have a conventional practice as such. I don't do surgery. I'm actually trying to do everything, if I can, impossible to avoid it. And obviously, especially if you've got horse injuries, then it's better if I go to them than they come to me. They've got long travelling potentially in horse boxes or trailers. Then I want the treatment that I do to not be shook up or undone or contrared by anything that long journey home. So I tend to go around the country, and if there's enough work in any area, I'll go. As a few people will bring their dogs to me as well and come for treatment themselves sometimes. So yeah, but most of my work is sort of on the road really, and it's good to see the countryside as well. I mean, it sort of racks up the miles in the car, but that's I'm used to that by now.
Well, I know a lot of people that will be incredibly grateful to vets like you, because we're living in a time now where as humans, many are a little bit suspicious, a bit wary of going to doctors and into the NHS. Many are seeking alternative therapies, and it's just so wonderful that you're pretty much, I think, the only vet so far in the UK that's really spoken up against mRNA and the whole COVID agenda. And you're a holistic vet too. And, we are a nation of animal lovers. Apparently, we've got the best animal welfare in the world. And I read an article about the fact that I think it was George Eustace that said that we are a nation of animal lovers. And we're the first country in the world, apparently, to pass animal welfare laws which recognise animals as sentient beings. And yet, when the COVID pandemic started, we actually we aired it on UK Column News that Lord Bethel at one point was talking about a cull on domestic cats. Literally getting rid of every single cat because of COVID. And I've just recently read that in Australia, and to those of you that are watching in Australia and haven't heard this, it would appear that in some areas in Australia, they're thinking of putting cats into lockdown. And we've heard a lot of news, and we'll come to the news perhaps on dogs in a minute. But Roger, when it comes to something like COVID, which we know hasn't been isolated, and in my opinion, it's a synthetic, inverted commas, virus anyway. What is the likelihood of cats and dogs and our domestic animals catching COVID from us? Because we talk a lot about zoonotic diseases, how diseases are transmitted from animals to humans, and yet here we are saying, well, maybe it's reverse zoonosis. And is it possible for animals to catch viruses, and I say that in inverted commas, from humans? Do we know of any research that's been done with regards to this?
I'm not aware of any, particularly in terms of whether animals can catch, COVID from people. And also, the question of whether it can go the other way, I'm not sure has been properly researched either, because when you've got something that is now endemic in the population, as SARS-CoV-2 is in all its different variants, then to be able to, even if an animal were to, if it could be isolated from it, there's no proof that it came from where it came from, and or whether people have got it from their animals as well. Everybody's meeting so many other people out and about that you couldn't prove that it came from the animals. So even if animals were able to contract it, there's no proof that it could necessarily go in the opposite direction. The research just really hasn't been done. I think it's, viruses are usually fairly species specific. They don't often cross species, although if you look at the World Health Organization, some of their decrees have sort of said that they think zoonosis is the all disease in humans starts in animals, which is quite ridiculous. So what are you setting yourself up to decree in future? And, people might think that the World Health Organization is only involved in human health, but there is also this One Health idea. And if the World Health Organization, if the pandemic treaty was signed by the UK and the international health regulations go through as intended from what we've seen so far, then it is theoretically possible that the Director General, Tedros, of the World Health Organization could unilaterally decide, if he wanted to make a decree about animals on the basis that if they want to try and put the blame onto our pets or onto our animals, then who's going to stand up and say no? That is a very real risk. It gets complicated and it gets political.
And that actually leads me to my next question, because quite correctly you've said there is no research. So when Lord Bethel came out a couple of years ago to say that at one point they were considering a cat cull, this wouldn't be based on any kind of evidence, any kind of science. Not that we can probably trust the science anymore, but it wouldn't have been based on anything. But it brings me back to, well, a number of things, because I'm linking now animals with humans all the time. And for a very long time, we've been told for safety, again, to keep your pet safe, it's best to microchip them. And I bought into it, Roger. My cat, I was terrified, what if my cat got lost or got injured and nobody knew who he belonged to. So for the best intentions and the best will in the world, I've microchipped all my cats. I mean, I've only got one at the moment, but going back, they've been microchipped. And I know a lot of our audience are going to be saying, that's probably not a good idea anymore, and we wouldn't want to do that anymore. And certainly we're seeing the narrative being ramped up of, are we going to have microchips planted in our hands to swipe biometric data to get on the train, to get into the supermarket? What are your views and what's your advice going forward with regards to microchips in animals?
Yeah, I think we've got to draw a bit of a separation between the human situation and the animal situation. Microchips were brought out for our animals because if they get lost or have an accident, they can't explain what's going on. There's a language barrier there. So from that point of view, microchips have got a very valid use in terms of helping to, rejoin owners and their pets in that sort of emergency situation. And I think that will remain. The human situation is very different. We don't need microchips because we have to be able to be identified in an emergency situation. Unless we're totally unconscious, we've got the ability to tell people who we are and what's happened and what's gone wrong. And even if we're unconscious, we'll probably be in a situation where we've got a wallet or a phone or something that will tell people who we are. And obviously people put this, in case of emergency, number in their mobile phone for just that sort of scenario. So it's a very different situation. On one level, I don't like putting foreign things into bodies. In the case of microchipping, then for the animals, they are pretty inert as they are. I think that probably the benefits from microchipping animals outweigh any potential negative. But when it comes to trying to use that as a precedent for human situation, yeah, I'm not buying that either. As far as I'm concerned, it's the mark of the beast.
Right. Well, I think you've made that quite plain, so thank you. And in the age of vaccines, we know they're not vaccines. So for anybody that's watching that's saying, why is Debbie keep calling these vaccines? I am really for our newer audience and for people that may be joining us for the first time. But for those of our audience that have been with us for a long time, we know that these aren't vaccines. However, animals have vaccines too. And whilst we've all become very suspicious and we don't want any more vaccines as humans, what is your advice going forward with our domestic pets? Because we know from our previous interview that we did with you, Roger, and I was very surprised to realize that mRNA wasn't being rolled out in animals like we thought it was, that there was only one that was being used in pigs. So for anybody now that's sitting watching, whose animals are coming up for vaccination time, what's your advice to them?
Yeah, vaccination is always a sort of big subject when it comes to discussions. Really, certainly at the moment, as you quite rightly pointed out, there are no mRNA vaccinations (inverted commas) licensed or authorised for animal use in the UK at this point in time. So people who are worried that their precious pooch or cat is going to be given an mRNA product, they can rest easy that isn't the case. There is some evidence that shows that vaccination from, say, puppy or kitten will last considerably longer than people are usually encouraged to give boosters. There is certainly evidence in dogs to suggest that vaccination can last at least 7 years, and if not life. Having said that, everybody's situation is going to be slightly different. People who live in cities and where they walk their dogs, particularly in areas where a lot of dogs will be walking, are obviously, if there is anything going round, are going to be far more liable to encounter some sort of pathogen, which the vaccinations obviously cover. And cats likewise, you tend to get cats in much more close proximity in highly built up areas for that reason too. Having said that, there is as I say, there's plenty of evidence to suggest vaccination lasts longer than we're encouraged to vaccine. But on one hand, I've also got to stick up for the vets as well to a certain degree, because vets are we're bound to follow the inclusion instructions within the vaccines by the manufacturers. So if the manufacturers have licensed the vaccines to be repeated and with the booster to be given every 3 years, if vets don't do that, and then that animal is subsequently found to then get immunocompromised and then get ill from one of those conditions for which they were supposed to be being vaccinated from, the vet would potentially be liable for not having given the booster at the right time in accordance with the data sheet. And yet that cat or dog that was immunocompromised might well have become ill anyway, just because they're immunocompromised. So, and there's also this whole thing about titer testing. So you can look for antibodies for some of the core vaccine diseases to see if immunity is present. And obviously, we've all learned quite a lot about immunity recently over the last few years, I think. And as long as there are antibody levels there, then it also means that there are memory cells there. Although yet very often, if an antibody level is found to be low, people will be encouraged to have a booster on the basis that their cover is low. And people need to really understand that a titer test is more of a measure of the current pathogen exposure and challenge that their animal is encountering, rather than a measure of the immune status, because the body is very clever, it's very efficient. So if the body isn't encountering a bacteria or virus that would be being vaccinated against, then the body doesn't carry on making antibodies, because there's no point. So the antibody levels will drop, and so the titer test will show this drop. But the memory cells, which can gear up very, very quickly if they are challenged to produce more antibodies, are still there. But titer testing can't see the memory cells. But we know from how the immune system functions that they're there. So, there is good reason, good evidence to suggest that if a titer test produces any antibody level at all, then there is cover there. And likewise, if you've got a situation where an antibody level is already high on the titer test, then what's happening is that animal is being naturally challenged and naturally boosted in the environment through wherever they're walking or roaming or whatever they're doing. And so again, there is no need to boost those antibody levels, because the environment's doing it already. And the other thing we've also got to bear in mind is that there are, as we know, lots of different variants and strains of the different viruses, and likewise there are different variants of the bacteria as well. And vaccinations aren't 100% effective in terms of cover. There will be some strains which will be covered, and there will be other strains which may be circulating around, or obviously to a certain degree you get selection for as a result, that won't be covered by the vaccination. So it's not 100% guarantee. And certainly if you've got a virus, like flu, and the equine flu is one of the horse vaccinations. Equine flu is one that's given usually every couple of every year, and there's a vaccine board that sits and chooses which strains are circulating, and then different manufacturers will have different strains in their equine flu vaccination. So that is still guesswork in terms of what's circulating around. And there was a situation in the late teens where vaccines were actually didn't have any of the currently circulating strain in them. So but there will probably be some degree of crossover protection, but it's always an emotive situation, and vets are in some ways caught in the middle, because science says we don't need to vaccinate every year. Certainly, we don't need to necessarily do it every 3 years. But if the product says on the data sheet that this must be boosted every 3 years, if vets don't do that, then they become potentially liable for that situation. So I can understand, we've become more litigious as a society. So I can understand both sides of that coin, and people in their own situation really need to consider their danger level, if you like, to what's the likelihood of my dog or cat experiencing these being challenged by these viruses in the real world. And on the whole, if you live in the countryside, you're far less likely to be challenged. If you live in the city, you're probably more likely to be challenged, and that's where the outbreaks of FIV and things like that tend to happen. So it's not a one hat fits all situation. People need to consider what their personal situation is, where they walk their animals or how much they roam, and where do they draw the line in their sand in terms of their risk analysis as well. And also, dog owners, if people have dogs which have dog walkers, or they have to go to doggy daycare, or go to kennels for going on holiday or something like that, very often they are required for their vaccinations to be up to date in terms of by the data sheet. And again, the kennels are in a no-win situation as well, because their license is provided by the local authority, and the local authorities haven't got up to date with the science. So it's not quite as straightforward as it might first appear. There are sort of medical and scientific reasons that say vaccination doesn't have to be given so frequently, but there are sort of political and legislative situations that actually suggest that they will require them more frequently. So, as I say, it's not as straightforward as it might first seem.
No, it really isn't. And as you're saying that, I completely identify. When I had my previous cats, who I've now lost through old age, they couldn't go to the cattery when we moved without being fully vaccinated, and you had to actually show the certificate of vaccination as well. So I think you're absolutely right. And for people watching, it is going to be on your own risk benefits. You need to do your own risk benefit. What's it called? It's not a survey, is it? Analysis. That's it. Thank you very much. A risk analysis. You need to do your own risk analysis. But as you were talking there, Roger, and I don't want to keep coming back to COVID, and I promise I won't, because I know that when we were speaking last time, I was watching the chat box as the interview was going out, and a lot of people were talking about diet. So I want to come to that in a minute. But just before I do, there seems to be a lot of evidence, especially through the Pfizer papers, the Pfizer dump, that Professor Chris Flowers and the War Room and Dr. Naomi Wolf are analysing at the moment, of shedding. So shedding of spike proteins from vaccinated people, especially ones that have just been recently boosted, onto unvaccinated people. I suspect I probably know the answer to this question, but I want to ask you anyway, so that we've got it on the record. Is there, or do you know of any research that would suggest that the spike protein shedding that we seem to be seeing that's affecting humans, could that be affecting our dogs and our cats? Because we've certainly seen some reports of animals reacting in a slightly different way or behaving slightly differently. Now, whether this is to do with being with vaccinated owners and shedding, I don't know. I just wondered if you'd heard anything through the veterinary circles about this.
No, to be honest, Debbie, I haven't read anything that I could really sort of want to hang my hat on. I mean, the whole thing is so difficult to really know where the truthful situation is, because as we know from very early on, a lot of these detections are being done by PCR test. And if that PCR test is being overcycled like we know it was, then, as Gary Mullis said, the inventor of the PCR, if you cycle it high enough, you can find anything anywhere. And so I do wonder what detection process has been used, even for the cases which are anecdotal, which have been reported. How much was the PCR test actually cycled to make this detection? Was it actually a clinically significant level if you had that data to then interpret it? And I suspect probably it isn't. And this is really where I'd really sort of advise people sort of if PCR tests are being done, you've got to really look at the cycling levels being done. I don't know if those have been updated in terms of what they've been instructed to do by the NHS going forward, but obviously you can manipulate the cycling of the PCR test to artificially make it appear whether something is on the rise or on the decrease. So I think just the interpretation is very risky. I don't think the research has really been done to that degree to really understand the risks to our animals, either from the virus or, as you say, from the spike protein. I suspect probably the level of shedding from the spike protein, is it high enough to make a difference in our pets? I don't know. I haven't personally been asked to address that situation in any of the animals I've been asked to treat. Maybe the spike protein receptors in animals are slightly different to humans, and it's sufficient that the spike protein doesn't get in, or the virus doesn't get in there. So it's just a big unknown, I think, is the end of the day, Debbie. I wouldn't want to say categorically either way, because I think there are so many uncertainties in terms of what has gone on in detection that even if a paper came out without knowing how the PCR test was done, I wouldn't know how to interpret it anyway, to be honest.
I think you've just summed it up again, Roger, because like everything else with this whole pandemic, we don't have any research. We literally don't have any research. So jumping on a little bit and changing topic a little bit, but we're living in an era where the food chain we've got disruptions in our human food chain. I'm already seeing some shortages of vegetables, fresh vegetables and fresh fruit in our supermarkets. And I'm thinking it could be a problem with disruption. I'm stocking up on cat food, and I'm sure other people are stocking up on dog food. But when we were talking last time about mRNA, there was a lot of chat in the chat box about diet. And going forward, when we run out, if we run out of your cat's favourite food or your dog's favourite dried food or whatever, number one, should animals be fed on a meat diet, a vegetarian diet? And number two, if we do have shortages of pet food, what should we be feeding our pets on?
I'm a great advocate for species-appropriate diet, whatever the species. And as far as I'm concerned, both cats and dogs are carnivores. Cats are called obligate carnivores. They have to have meat in their diet. And dogs are called facultative carnivores, which means that they are predominantly carnivorous, but they can eat other ingredients too. However, having said that, just because a dog is facultative carnivore doesn't mean that meat, and primarily meat, is the main thing that keeps them healthy. Nature has evolved through the wild, through far longer than we've been having them as domesticated animals, and this is an advantage from an evolutionary point of view. If in times of hardship, during those mini ice ages that have happened at various different times, if animals weren't easy to find, then if a wolf or a dog could survive on something else to get it through the winter to get back to the point where hunting became more prolific again, then obviously that's better than starving to death. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the ability to survive is the ability to be the healthiest you possibly can. So my aim is always to feed the optimum diet. And as far as I'm concerned, for both dogs and cats, that is carnivore diet. And by that, I mean raw meat and bone, and meaty bones. So there are lots of raw diets out there. There's something like 90 different raw food manufacturers these days. And I feed my own dog. I treat it. I do it DIY, and it's actually a lot more simple than it is often made out to be. So and unfortunately, when we go through vet school, a lot of the nutrition classes are taught by or financed by the pet food companies. So they will provide free pet food to the referral centres, to the animal hospitals where we do our clinical training. They will sponsor the lectures, and I don't know what the current contractual situation is between the vet schools and pet food manufacturers, but certainly I've seen contracts in the past where the pet food company has the veto on what students are taught in terms of nutrition. So a lot of vets are taught some nutrition, but it's very basic, and it is more about understanding a packet than it is about understanding how the diet should be properly fed. And I always say to people, if in doubt, what did you see on David Attenborough last night? If you don't see it in the wild, we don't have to do it for them. So, dogs and cats don't attack wheat fields. They don't dig vegetables. They don't climb fruit trees and eat lots of fruit. They might scavenge it sometimes when if it's fallen on the ground and they're hungry. I'm sure they enjoy a sugar hit the same as we do. But primarily their diet is to hunt and kill and scavenge carcasses and animals, obviously. And part of that whole process of eating isn't just what we get from a chemical point of view. There's the physicality of the diet as well. So, they will crunch bones and tear off meat, and that process in itself helps to keep the teeth clean and healthy and the gums clean and healthy, so they don't get tartar build up on the teeth the way we see in many domesticated pets, where they're fed kibbles, which are primarily vegetable based because they're cheap. Some of them only have a minuscule amount of animal content in them. And, we've got cancer now in dogs now approaching, I think the figure is 1 in 4, and it's predicting to go down to 1 in 2. If you look at what the human point of view from cancer is, a lot of it's put down to stress and diet and pollutants and all the rest of it. But, we tend to look after our animals with great deal of care. They want for nothing. Their stress levels are very low. And so we have to assume that actually the diet is probably the biggest factor for our pets in terms of what is causing chronic disease. Because, I always say, if you put petrol into a diesel car, don't be surprised if it doesn't run very well. So if you put, predominantly plant-based diets into carnivores, don't be surprised if they don't function very well. And one of the ways that the body indicates that it's not functioning very well is chronic inflammation, which is the background for cancers, for autoimmune disease. It's the reason why so many dogs are itchy and have allergies, because again, the skin isn't just a protective barrier between the insides and the outsides. It is the biggest organ of the body, and it is an organ of excretion. So toxins are pushed out through it. If the kidneys and the liver are doing their job and they're being a bit overloaded with all the toxins going in, then the skin comes into play, and that's what creates all the inflammation in the skin, which you then get the allergies and the itchy and all the rest of it. So, there are big ramifications for diet, and there have been, I've seen fairly recently, I think there was in Australia, one of the organisations over there basically said that they swapped all their dogs from kibble fed onto raw, and the difference in health was phenomenal. And the vet bills went down, and they didn't need to see them for half as many things. And I think that is the predominant experience of people who feed raw properly. And I say properly because there's lots of people feeding raw with the best intention, not doing it properly. And actually, if you sort of widen it, one of the big ways that that raw feeding is very good for our pet cats and dogs is sort of lower the tone a little bit, the volume of poo coming out the back end goes down to about a third of what it was previously. And this is predominantly the reason why we have problems in our parks, because dogs that are being fed kibble and walked in the parks, what's coming out is 2/3 insoluble, undigestible fibre from the kibbles and the plant-based food. So, of course, they don't wash away, they don't disappear. Whereas I'm sure if you think back to when you were a kid, if you saw, dog poo in the street, it went white in the sun and it crumbled to dust and it disappeared. So the reason why we've got all this public health issue in our parks is because we're feeding the wrong, inappropriate diet. The earth didn't, biology didn't evolve for feces to hang around in the environment. And yet that's exactly what's happening. So, a much bigger volume as well. So, there's all sorts of indicators in many different aspects of life that tell us that, we primarily feed, or the vast majority of people, with the best intention, and the vets are doing it with the best intention as well. That's how they've been taught, and they, you go to university to learn, but that's what they've been taught. So they are saying what they believe and what they're taught. And so, but ultimately, it doesn't change the fact that that these kibble diets are causing disease, and there have been a number of different vets throughout the years who've been trying to highlight the problem. I'm friends with Tom Lonsdale, who's written a couple of books on the subject, and he used to stand for election for the Royal College elections every year. And I was one of his nominators. And so, he always, whatever question he was ever asked in sort of hustings or online in regards to his opinion on anything, he always brought it back to the diet, because he didn't want anybody to ever claim that people voted for him based on something other than his opinion over raw feeding. And so he was basically saying that as a profession, we should be feeding correctly and not advocating feeding McDonald's every meal. And he used to get regularly 300-400 vets would vote for him, and yet as a profession, the Royal College and the BVA refused to support any research into proving that situation. Although in recent years there is a lot more research coming through, which is vindicating what Tom and I have been saying for many years. So, and others, there's obviously a few hundred vets out there who are very much supportive of raw feeding. There is a raw feeding veterinary society who are trying to gather all the scientific evidence and present it to the professions around the world to try and improve the perception of diet. In terms of if food shortages come along, I still think species appropriate diet is a species appropriate diet, and we just need to try and find other ways. If you get fresh roadkill, sounds horrible, but it's dogs and cats were scavengers, and they used to eat whatever was fresh. And I also think it's probably one of the reasons why cats have decimated songbird population so much in the UK too, because they don't really want the kibble. That's in their nature to hunt and eat, and they know what's good for them. I think there's a book written somewhere, and it's called Cats Would Eat Mice. And again, it's a book that went into the advocating feeding raw to cats, and unfortunately, the commercial pet foods put taste enhancers into the kibbles and into the various different foods to encourage palatability and to encourage the animals to eat it. So 8 out of 10 cat owners don't know their cats are addicts, and unfortunately, cats aren't that fussy. You look at a leopard in the wild, It doesn't decide, oh, I only eat zebra. I'm not going to eat that wildebeest, which just happens to be at my feet and is ready to eat. They eat everything. They're not fussy eaters in the wild. They have been made to be fussy eaters by their addictions, and that will probably be quite controversial, but that's the truth of the situation.
Roger, did you say raw feeding? Now, I'm going to play stupid here, because of course our viewers and our listeners are all going to know what raw meat is. However, when it comes to our animals, I just want to ask you, as a vet, what you would give your dog, because and I know that dogs and cats are all very, very unique, but for an average dog, an average cat, so let's take a dog first. Should we be using, can we go to the supermarket and buy some mints? Not that probably anybody would want to go to and buy supermarket mints, but is it better to go to the butcher? Can we use frozen food? What kind of meat? It's a minefield. It's like a raw food diet, great, but specifically in your expert opinion, what would you give an average dog, for example?
Yeah, it's as you say, they are all individuals, but I always try and encourage people to aim for the gold standard. And if they then fall a bit short, that's fine. And some individual animals will be able to eat the gold standard, and some will struggle. And there's reasons I can talk about as to why that is as well. So, like for my dog, he's a little Patterdale, and he has raw chicken drumsticks, and occasionally he has some breast of lamb, and occasionally I give him mince as well. So on a very rough scale, rule of thumb, you're feeding about 20% of the body weight over a whole week. And that's then you're feeding to eye. So if your dog or cat is too overweight, then you feed less. If it's underweight, you feed more. And obviously if they're working dogs or something where they're going out and doing a lot of activity, then you have to feed them more on those days. And the other important thing about the diet is it's not just about chemical composition, it's the whole physical nature of the diet as well. It plays a function in their health. So I'm not a fan of pre-ground raw feeding, and there's a lot of products out there that do that. The reason being, one of the scare stories that vets will push around is that bacterial contamination. So, but if you think about it, if there's bacterial contamination on a chicken drumstick, for example, if there was some bacterial contamination on it, it would be on the outside. So as they crunch up the bones and the meat and they swallow it all together, then all the contamination that's on the outside hits the stomach acid when it's at its strongest first. So that's what destroys all the bacteria. If everything is pre-ground, then if there is any contamination on the original lump of meat and bone, then as it's ground up and mixed together, all the contamination gets mixed throughout that food as well. So by the time some of the bacteria are encountered by the stomach acid has already been a little bit neutralized by digesting the food on the way. So from a health point of view, it's better obviously that bacterial contamination is killed in the stomach and doesn't pass on down. And that contamination can happen in any food. It's not unique to raw feeding, which is what the pro-kibble people will often say. There has been contamination found in kibble foods as well, so it's not a unique situation. The other aspect of feeding in big lumps is that part of the function of the teeth is to crack up those raw bones, and again they've got to be raw. Cooked bones splinter, raw bones don't, and that's where it's really important to make that distinction. So that's why raw feeding is so good. So it'll keep the teeth and the gums clean and healthy by crunching up those bones, and that's their job. So there is a physical aspect to the diet as much as there is a chemical aspect to the diet. And that, unfortunately, is very much overlooked by a lot of the commercial raw feeding diets which are put out there, which are sort of ground up. And so, it's important to get, we're trying to replicate what nature does. We talk about dogs and cats being carnivores. It's perhaps more accurate to say they're carcassivores, because they eat carcasses. So that's what we've got to think about, what we're trying to replicate. So there's an element of meat and bone, and if the meat is on the bone, then the meat is protecting the esophagus, which is the bit from your mouth down to your stomach. It protects that as everything goes down. And then once everything gets into the stomach, the acid dissolves it, and then the bone and everything, and it all passes through nicely. So it's important to get that right in terms of the physical aspect of it. And then, of course, if the dogs and the cats are chewing a little bit more and having to crunch up their diet a little bit more, it's more satisfying to them. They have to work a little bit, maybe pulling some meat off a bone or crunching and working at it, and that works their jaws. It gets a certain degree of endorphins released as well, which obviously has some sort of calming effect. We know endorphins do that. So, there are potentially, sort of behavioural potential effects to feeding the diet in the right function, in the right way. And then it's a question really of affordability. Ideally, it'd be nice if we could all afford to feed our pet carnivores or carcassivores organic meat that's grown up happy on a regenerative farm, or organically, and all the rest of it. But the reality is, not everybody can afford to do that, and so we've got to work within what people can afford. And actually, the biggest benefit to the raw feeding is there's two elements to it. One is moving away from the commercial McDonald's kibble, and the other is obviously what you're moving on to. And I would probably say that, in my opinion, it is more important what you're moving away from so much than what you're moving on to. So if people can't afford to feed organic, and that all they can afford to do is go down to the supermarket and buy the cheapest versions of the raw meat and bone, then that is still going to be a lot better than the option of feeding the commercial kibbles. So we sort of got to sort of work out where the benefits are mostly coming from, and actually moving away from processed food, which we know from human stuff, talking about the science of human feeding. We know that processing food is not healthy on the whole. So that's what we're trying to move away from, that processed food. So that's sort of the sort of nuts and bolts of it, really.
So it really is give a dog a bone. I mean, that's what we're coming down to, and I'm just sitting here thinking that a lot of people watching this are going to be thinking, right, okay, well, we want to move our dogs onto this. But of course, my we've had dogs all my life, and dogs get fussy, and some dogs enjoy their treats. And I can imagine a lot of people watching this will be saying, well, is it going to be difficult moving my animal from what I've been feeding them for the last goodness knows how many years to a raw diet? Will they see changes? I mean, will they see behavioral changes as they move diet? Will they see physical changes as they move diet? What sort of things are people likely to see if they decide, actually, do you know what? I'm going to throw away the kibble. I'm not going to use the produced pet foods anymore, and I'm going to do what Roger suggests.
Yeah, I mean, they will see benefits fairly quickly. Dogs, on the whole, are more easily swapped over. The sort of two schools of thought amongst the raw feeding vets, in that some people will try and swap them over more gradually, the dogs more gradually, and others will go, we can just swap over in one big go. And again, as I say, dogs are all individuals. So some dogs will just swap. You can just literally throw them, a drumstick or chicken leg or something, and they'll just crunch it up. They think Christmas has arrived every day, and they'll be overly happy. So you and the big changes, of course, you'll see in the digestion. The raw diet is so much more digestible. Sort of going on to sort of the other end of the feeding, what comes out. So typically, the volume coming out from the backside when they go to the toilet will be about a third of what they previously used to produce. So you could argue that 2/3 of a bag of kibble is mostly coming outside coming out the back end. There's only the bioavailability of the plant material is very much less than what they'll pick up from the raw meat and bones. The other aspect of defecating is it actually serves a function in that if you've had dogs, you know that they've got anal glands at the back, and sometimes they can get bunged up, and then the vet has got to express them, and it's not very pleasant for anybody involved or the dog. But part of the function in the wild of defecating is that when they go to the toilet, they strain. And because the poo is that much harder, it actually expresses the anal glands a little bit when they poo. So it's part of their territory marking behavior. And if they aren't producing sufficiently hard feces, then that function isn't happening, and of course then things build up, and then they become impacted, and they can get infected and all the rest of it. So they do need to be doing a certain amount of straining, but obviously not too much when they're defecating. So the other rule of thumb when you're feeding is watch them when they go to the toilet and see how much they're straining. And if they're straining too much, you're feeding too much bone and maybe not enough organ meat. Because you need a little bit of organ meat in there as well, a little bit of liver, but it can make them a little bit loose. So you want to sort of match that to if you're feeding something that's perhaps got a little bit more bone in it, so you balance what comes out the back end. And obviously, if they're not straining enough, then they're not going to fulfill that function of helping to express the anal glands. So you need to increase the bone content. So that's really the rules of thumb of feeding is, if they're too fat, feed less, too thin, feed more, straining too much, feed less bone, add a bit more organ meat in. If they're not straining enough, add more bone in or maybe a little bit less organ meat. And if you follow those rules, then you'll pretty much get it right. The whole concept of a balanced diet is something that the pet food companies really have they sort of invented, because obviously we do need certain nutrients across the board. But when they're wanting owners to satisfy the dog's complete nutritional requirements from a bag, and they only want it to be their bag, then they've got to try and make sure that everything is balanced within that meal as to what they think a dog needs. But the fact that you've got different bags which will have different contents mean that even that's not an exact science. So, but if I said to you, Debbie, how much calcium did you have in your breakfast this morning, you wouldn't be able to tell me. And we don't know all of our balanced diet. We don't make sure that every single meal that we have is exactly the proportions, because we don't know them, and they're going to be different for individuals as well. So the fact that the diet contains everything, over a couple of weeks, the body will take what it needs, and as it needs it in the proportions that it needs it. And so to a certain degree, if you're feeding the sort of food which nature intended them to eat, which is raw meat and bone, then the nutrient requirements will be approximately right for all the calorific intake that they need. So that's how you know that they're getting the right diet, because they're eating the right food. You've only got to worry about balancing everything else when you're feeding them a fundamentally incorrect diet. So nature has already worked it out, and this idea that we can do it better than nature is it's just ridiculous.
I'm a cat owner, so we've been talking a lot about dogs. Are you saying, because I'm cringing, I have to say it, the thought of it, but are you saying that feeding my cat dead mice would be better than I'm using wet food and dry food, so kibble food in essential. Would you say that I've got to give my cat mice and things with bones, or should I go fishing? And could I use tinned fish perhaps, or do I need to use fresh fish? What's the deal with cats?
Yeah, Debbie, cats are a little bit more tricky, partly because I think they had to use more taste enhancers with the cat foods to get them to eat them. The cats do tend to be, they've got the idea of there being more fussy, and I don't actually believe that. I think if you look at cats in the wild, they're not that fussy at all. They eat what's available, and they're happy to do so. So cats can be very much more difficult to swap over onto a raw diet, and sometimes you do then have to sort of wean them off what they're addicted to and replace it with the raw feed and do it more gently. But again, the sort of food that they're eating, chicken would be a good one for them, and maybe because they're a bit smaller, take the tip of the wings off and feed them chicken wings and let them crunch it up. But cats will catch birds, so you've also, to a certain degree, think what would these animals be hunting and catching in the wild if they were roaming free. So as you say, mice would be the sort of right sort of size, and birds would be the right sort of size. You wouldn't get a domestic cat hunting down wildebeest. The big cats, the leopards and whatever do, and the lions and tigers do, but obviously our domestic moggies are a fraction of that size. So we've got to match what their jaws are capable of coping with, in terms of what we're going to feed them. So, and then again, look at the sort of density of the bones. So large weight-bearing bones are going to be too hard. They're not going to be able to crunch through them for certainly, even for sort of dogs with knuckle bones. That's where they risk breaking teeth by trying to crunch through something that's too hard. So, try and keep to non-weight-bearing bones, or if you're feeding something where you're going to be weight-bearing bones, it will have to be of a size like a rabbit, for example, that they would all be able to munch on and crunch and catch in the wild if that's what they were doing. And obviously everybody, most people have got their domestic cats that they have in their home. But if you think about all the farm cats, which are kept and just basically live outside, and they're there to catch the rats and mice and whatever else, they will probably very rarely eat the cat food. They will look after themselves, and most of them live to ripe old ages very healthily. And that's the other aspect of the diet is, food should be your medicine and medicine should be your food. And it's as true for our animals as it is for us. So, if they're on the right diet, on the whole, they're very much more healthy and they need very much less intervention.
Thank you, Roger, for that. That gives me plenty of, pardon the pun, food for thought. One quick question, because a lot of people ask us all of these preparations for fleas, for ticks, etc. What would your remedy be if people don't want to go down the chemical route for a flea prevention or tick treatment, for example?
Yeah, they're tricky ones because we've changed the environment where the pets are living as well. So we've made it very much more hospitable for the fleas, especially. They like to live in the carpets under the skirting boards and live in the home, and they tend to just hop on for a meal and then hop off again. So it is more difficult to cope with from that perspective. I mean, there are various essential oils, but obviously you've got to be careful with those because they can be too strong for pets as well. And there can be some various herbs which you can try and use to help with fleas and deworming and things like that. And occasionally, people might have to do what they don't want to do. If they do happen to unfortunately get an outbreak of something, then you've just got to deal with it. And the same with going back to the food slightly. If someone is they've swapped their dog over to or the cat over to their raw diet, and they're happy with doing it at home and their own and all the rest of it. But if that dog has then got to go and stay with their parents or grandparents or somebody, a friend, while they're on holiday, who can't necessarily cope with feeding that in the same way, then for sure, feeding some of the commercial feeds for for a short period of time while someone is away is certainly better than going back onto a kibble. So we do what we can, the best we can, for the majority of the time. And if we get that right, we don't need to beat ourselves up. If we've got to try do something different if circumstances dictate, what we do for the majority of the time, it will determine the majority of their health. And said before, financial ability also comes into it. And I don't want people feeling bad that they can't afford to do the gold standard with organic and all the rest of it. You're still doing the best by your pets by doing what you can afford to do, and feeding the raw and doing what you can in whatever different way.
Oh, you know what? It's quite clear that we could talk forever on dogs, cats, domestic animals, but I am really keeping my eye on the clock. But what I want to say to our viewers is we're going to be delighted to be having Roger back again to talk about farm animals, because it's a huge subject, farming and farm animals. So I promise you we will come back to that. So before I hand to you for the final word, Roger, my final question to you is, what do you think the future holds for domestic pets, dogs, cats, hamsters, animals to keep you company, animals to give you love, for you to give animals love, with the 15-minute cities around the corner, springing up right in front of us? What do you believe the future of our domestic pets is?
It's a very good question, and it's difficult to know absolutely. If this whole, you'll own nothing and be happy scenario is what they try and push us into, and as you say, into a 15-minute city. I think there was a series on telly recently. I didn't watch it, but it was based on a man and a woman who shared effectively a flat. One worked at night and the other worked during the day, and they basically shared the accommodation at different, between night and day, and they never, ships passing in the night, they never actually met, and eventually they did, I think. But if that's the sort of scenario where they're wanting us to share accommodation like that, and be restricted in cities, then there have been some indications that they're not keen on people having pets. Obviously, they still have to be fed. They're wanting to restrict our meat consumption for people down to 16 kilos a year, which is less than was rationed during the Second World War. So you can imagine there's going to be a huge attack on animal farming and meat production, and they want to push us into Frankenmeat on that basis. So, again, I wouldn't be pushing that. I wouldn't want to feed my dog that, let alone have it myself. So you can see that there are intentions potentially for what they want to push the situation in the future with regard to pet ownership and the rest of it. They're obviously not going to do it straight away. They're going to find some sort of excuse, a bit like the One World Health Organization, blame it on something, on a zoonosis or some other hygiene or whatever else situation. I don't think it's going to happen straight away. I think there would be an outrage, and if they did. But obviously, as you mentioned before, there was talk about having a cat cull only a couple of years ago, and and people forget there was actually a pet cull after during the Second World War. So it's not without its precedent, but we've just got to be aware of potentialities and just say no. We will not comply to those sorts of diktats that are based on their concept of what they think their utopia for us will be. We are sovereign individuals ourselves, and we've got to make up our own minds, and we've got to stand up for what we want. And now is the time to stand up, because once they start pushing things like pet restriction on us in future, if that's what they intend, and there's reason to believe they might, then it's too late to stand up for our freedoms at that point. That's the point where we've already given up so many of our own that it will be almost impossible to stand up. So now is the time to be aware of what could potentially be coming down the track. And an easy life now is certainly not going to be an easy life in the future. We do need to motivate ourselves and make it plain that this is not acceptable.
You're absolutely right. And I thank you for that. And I completely agree. We all have to say no. And now is the time to say no. We've had 3 years and people are waking up everywhere. And I cannot reinforce it enough. Now is the time. Now is the time to say no. And of course, what you've just said, Roger, is if that puts into question the future of domestic animals in our lives, that also poses a question for our local vets, our vets that have been looking after our animals for 20, 30 years, our vets that are up the road, around the corner, not the big conglomerations. I'm sure they'll survive for the elite who are able to have animals, but for the rest of us, that just doesn't put our wonderful pets in danger. It puts your career in danger too, but that's a whole new story. But I cannot thank you enough, because it's so helpful to speak to a vet, because the animal kingdom, it's part of our humanity. It's part of creation. We go together. Animals and humans go together. So to have you be able to talk to us about all sorts of different animals and alternative ways and holistic ways of looking after animals is simply incredible. And I can't thank you enough. But as always, Roger, I'm going to throw to you for the last word. But I'm just going to reassure that our viewers and listeners that all the details of how to get in touch with Roger will be in the article beneath this interview. And our next interview will be on farming and farm animals. So we have that to look forward to. And by the way, if any of our members, we know that there's a thread on the forum for Roger. If you've got questions, please do ask us the questions, and we can pass them straight on to Roger. So with that, Roger, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you again very soon, but it's over to you for your last word.
Thanks, Debbie. I mean, as you quite rightly say, I think it was Gandhi who said you can tell the health of the nation by how they treat their animals in terms of society and humanity. But I just want to say that although I've been talking about sort of different ways of feeding our pets and managing them in a sort of more holistic and natural way, I don't want people who are watching to get angry at their regular vets. We are humans too. We all do what we do with the best intention and with the knowledge that we have at the time. And whilst many of the vets won't agree with what I'm saying, they are no different in terms of their motivation, in terms of how they work. And the problem is with the system. The problem is with how the universities are influenced by the pet food companies, by pharma, and how the research is skewed from that way. It's no different in anything else. Moving forward, we need to find a new way of separating the researchers from the universities and from the scientists, so that the research carried out and published is actually the truth, There is no pressure on whoever's doing it to produce the result that they are being paid to produce, because if they don't produce it, they will not get the next research grant. And if they don't get that research grant, then the laboratory or that aspect of their job will close. So, and jobs are on the line. So there are pressures on scientists for and the system is wrong. And what it's producing is therefore not what it should be. There are, normal vets, we're all busy people, and it's very difficult to perhaps go into some of the things that I've gone into. And a lot of the time I've stumbled across them, or they've stumbled into me. So I'm in a fairly unique position from that point of view. So, please don't get angry at your local vets because they aren't doing what I say. I'm not omniscient and at all either. I don't know everything there is to know, and we all make mistakes. So I would just say, be kind to your vets. They're doing the best that they can, but do your own research as well, and make your own decisions.